Most people know about the notorious Atlantic slave trade. However, the chilling facts and events stay hidden forever. When schools try to wipe out the disturbing details of the Atlantic slave trade, some censored books try to give an account of the trade's tortures, atrocities, and inhumane events. Despite this, they hide what's chilling, disturbing, and regretful for many countries, including the US, Portugal, the UK, and the Netherlands. But what are we talking about? From enslaving tens of millions of blacks, torturing and whipping them, cutting their ears and body parts, giving them not more than the size of the grave in ships for the journey, and getting forced work, and events like that are kept hidden. Even in some cases, black slaves were thrown into oceans to lower the weight of the vessels. But as proof, their ears were cut so awaiting masters in Europe and America could see that their slaves were bought but had to be thrown. What more facts and events are hidden? Welcome to a new episode of Black Culture Diary, a channel where we talk about the people that are, evidently, ancestors of and superior to everyone, the black. We scrutinize history here to bring the black culture back on the surface again. In this episode, we will reveal what schools don't tell you about the Atlantic slave trade. Let's get started. The Atlantic slave trade speaks for itself, in which millions of slaves from Africa were forcefully enslaved and sent to the Americas and Europe from the early 16th century to the late 19th century. Hundreds of ships would come to Africa from Europe and the Americas and capture thousands of black Africans. Then, they were chained in small spaces on the lower decks of the ships to carry as many slaves as possible. Conditions in vessels were not so different than those of a grave, where thousands of black Africans would lie, chained to the ground so they wouldn't move. That's why 15 to 25% of black Africans died during the Atlantic slave trade that transported over 12 million black Africans. In other words, 2.75 million blacks died during horrific journeys. In the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain began to conquer and establish colonies in the New World, forcing the Indian people to work on their plantations. However, the violence of conquest and the introduction of European diseases led to the death of many Indian slaves, creating a labor shortage in Europe. This shortage caused Europeans to look to Africa as a solution. As Portuguese and Spanish explorers made numerous expeditions to Africa, it became a significant source of slaves for Europe, the Spanish West Indies, and Portuguese colonies in Brazil. Hence, Africans gradually replaced the Indian slaves. However, something should be known here. Before being captured by Europeans, black Africans were not born slaves. Rather, they were the same humans as the Europeans and Americans were. However, the whites strategically linked Africans with being slaves. So people in Europe and America thought that Africans were slaves back in Africa as well. But that's not the reality. Before Africans were enslaved, they were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and more. They had families and communities, and were not mere commodities. However, when Europeans took over their communities, they became captives and were forced onto large ships, transported to Europe, and dispersed across the Americas and various parts of Europe. They were subjected to inhumane living conditions, severe labor, and cruel treatment, such as whipping and physical abuse. Forced to work long hours in extreme weather and in poor health conditions, they endured unimaginable suffering. Usually, when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, we have to mention the triangular route or trade. Although Africa suffered economically, the other two parts of the triangle, which are America and Europe, greatly benefited. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on black culture, history, civilization, and natural superiority. Let's continue now. It is believed that the first voyage of African slaves to the Americas sailed in 1526. Even before this period, Europeans bought Africans as slaves, and native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy did not allow the transportation of African slaves from Africa. This was not because of any sense of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and would corrupt European society with pagan and non-Christian practices. However, for economic reasons, King Charles V granted a charter on August 18, 1518, to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. The law was changed, and King Charles permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The triangular trade involved Europe taking goods to Africa, African slaves to the Americas, and American plantation raw materials back to Europe. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is the story of people in the three continents, but most importantly, those involved in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage, and the voyage was often marked with difficulties and even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take about 3 to 6 months, and the mortality rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships used to transport African slaves during the transatlantic slave trade had a specific design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions on board were inhumane, with slaves being locked up below deck in cramped quarters and having limited access to sunlight. They were forced to carry out enforced exercises, such as dancing, to ensure they remained healthy. The air inside the deck was hot, stale, and filled with the smell of dirt and human waste. The slaves suffered from starvation and thirst. They were packed tightly in chains below decks, facing epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates. Many also experienced physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans died during the voyage, which lasted several months. Only a tiny percentage of the Africans transported in the slave trade arrived in North America, with the majority being sent to the Caribbean and South America. Almost half of the slaves captured and transported out of Africa, totaling about 5 million, were sent to Brazil. At first, the Portuguese mostly enslaved Africans captured in tribal wars, but as demand increased, they began forcing their way into the interior of Africa to take captives. By the 1700s to 1850s, over 8 out of 10 Africans were forced into the slave trade. By 1820, almost 4 Africans for every 1 European had been transported across the Atlantic, and 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. It should be noted that before European and American slave traders captured Africans and enslaved them, African kings earlier sold criminals as slaves. However, with time, Europeans and Americans wanted more African slaves, which encouraged them to get slaves forcefully at gunpoint. Africans being captured had a common assumption that the Europeans were cannibals who planned on cooking and eating their captives. They didn't know they were considered a commodity and a tool to generate wealth for their masters. Sometimes, people in Europe and America would pay slave traders beforehand. Then, ships would go and capture Africans. However, since a significant percentage of them died, the buyers would feel doubted that slaves were not captured in the first place. But the reality was, some of those slaves died due to cramping, while some were thrown in oceans alive due to ship overweight. Slave traders would protect their hundreds of wine drums, but kill hundreds of slaves. Therefore, it was decided that the next time slaves would die or be thrown in the ocean, slave traders would cut their ears to show their buyers as proof. You can estimate how Africans were not considered humans, but only tools. However, now, the atrocities of the Atlantic slave trade are recognized and feel ashamed about. Apologies had come from different nations that benefited and grew their economies based on the labor from the slave trade. In 1998, UNESCO established the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition on August 23rd, which led to other events recognizing the detrimental impact of slavery on Africa. During the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded an apology for slavery from former slave-trading nations. While some nations were willing to apologize, others, including the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, opposed any apology, showing they don't regret it even today. Did you ever hear about the horrific details of the Atlantic slave trade in your school? Weren't the facts twisted and presented in a milder fashion in the textbooks? Do let us know in the comments section right below why events like Holocaust are presented more than events like the Atlantic slave trade, where Black Africans were wronged. Yes, biases and partiality exist. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody is talking about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and the evidence proving Black superiority. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.